to tell you the story of a guy named Ego Brown, odd name. This guy who grew up on the streets of DC named Ego Brown. And in the sort of 50s and 60s, he grew up shining shoes as he was a kid on the streets of DC. And there weren't a lot of licensure requirements. And he developed a work ethic in the city. Where I'm from, you think kids have to walk beans or to tassel corn. This guy figured out a way to grow a little business as a shoe shiner on the streets of DC. And then he finished school and he got a job as a clerk for the federal government and worked for a few years and decided that office jobs weren't really what he wanted to do. And he also had a vision to create jobs for other people. And so he quit his job for the federal government, and Ego Brown goes out and decides he's going to build a shoe shine business that has a little more scale to it. He's going to figure out how he can hire people. But over time, he would become known to sort of health and human services agencies as a guy that you send aspirational homeless people to. If you want to figure out a way to get somebody the skills they're going to need for a job, you send them to Ego Brown. And he'll take these young men under his wing and he'll get them a job. He'll find a way to teach them the skills and he'll get them gainfully employed. And over time, he ended up having more than 20 homeless people that worked for him in his shoe shine operation. Well, it turns out in 1985, some bureaucrat, some arm of the state of the DC government comes to Ego Brown on the street and says, "Hey, I'd like to see your license for doing your shoe shining." And he pauses, probably gets that lump in his throat that you get when you encounter an authority of the state that has all this power and you don't know how to navigate all the Byzantine rules of government. And he says, "Happily, I have my permit." And he pulls it out and he shows his permit. And they say, "That's not the right one." Today in DC, I don't know what the rules were in 1985, but today in DC, to be a shoe shiner, you have to have 4 different kinds of permits. You have to have a criminal background history. You have to have at least one of these is clearly legitimate to me, which is you have to demonstrate to DC that you've done all the paperwork so that you can pay your taxes. You have to pay a technology fee to be a shoe shiner in Washington, DC, and there's some 4th fee. So there are these processes, there are paperwork, there are lines, there are hallways in DC city government you need to figure out how to navigate. But it turns out if you do all 4 of those that are required today, it's a $337 total across the 4 fees as we looked into it. But that only licenses you to shoe shine indoors. So there are separate rules if you would want to shoe shine out of doors. And back in 1985, Ego Brown didn't know those rules, and so he was shut down. He wasn't formally shut down. He was driven back inside. He had to go back inside the barbershops. And his business struggled. And from 1985 to 1988, he tried to figure out how he could go outside again. He went through DC government repeatedly trying to figure out what's the pathway by which I can go back outside where my business works and I can grow, where I can have more employees, where I can be making a difference in the real world. When you leave your house to go off to work on Monday morning, does it matter that you have work to do? Does somebody benefit from the service that you provide or for the product that you produce? And Ego Brown was doing that, and he was doing that for a whole bunch of other people, but it turned out his business struggled a lot more when he was indoors from 1985 to 1988. So in 1988, he decided, on behalf of himself and 2 of his homeless former employees, he decided to sue the DC government. And a year and a half later, the Supreme Court ruled that these 1905 Jim Crow laws that had been put in place for ostensibly racist purposes in 1905 and then languished over the course of decades later when they didn't clearly probably have a racist purpose anymore, but DC found that they had a way to distinguish between the license that Ego Brown had to do outside vending and the license that he didn't have, which is to do outdoor shoe shining, which is the license that didn't exist under this old 1905 statute, and he'd been driven back inside. The DC government struck that down. Or the Supreme Court struck down this DC statute in 1989. Ego Brown went back out, and he spent another, I think it was 16 or 17 years on the street building a business, employing a lot of people, and having a lot of happy customers. We need to recognize that when there's a license, it should have a clear public interest that's trying to stop some harm that's objectively definable. And if there isn't one, there shouldn't be these licenses. But the second thing is we need to think of the lost opportunity cost of 80 years from 1905 to the mid-1980s. While these rules were in place, a whole bunch of customers didn't get their needs met, and as was demonstrated by the fact that Ego Brown could grow his business when it was outdoors, but he couldn't grow a shoe shining business when it was in the barbershop, there were a whole bunch of people that didn't create jobs and weren't employed and didn't have the dignity of work. And I think we need to get better as a movement at telling the story of the people who are harmed by these kind of licensure requirements. We need to do the hard work of not merely passing the statute to use the authority we have over DC and over military bases, but we need to lead a conversation so that other states are invited back into this and thinking about this trajectory we're headed toward a more complicated economy where jobs are going to be created and shed at a faster pace than ever before in human history. We need to put the burden back on local governments and on bureaucracies and on all levels of government to define who precisely is the victim that they're protecting if they're going to create encumbrances that make it more difficult to create the jobs that actually benefit our neighbors and provide dignity for the workers. And it's my privilege to work with Mike Lee on this legislation, and I thank Heritage for hosting us today. Thank you.